What if the law wasn't first given to Moses, but to someone else? For most believers, that question sounds like heresy. The image is burned into our minds. Moses on Mount Sinai, the thunder, the cloud, the divine voice speaking commandments etched in stone. It's the moment we're taught to mark as the beginning of God's law, the foundation of morality, the birth of the covenant. But what if we've mistaken the middle of the story for its beginning? Why do we believe the law started at Sinai? Is it because it's what we were taught, or because it's what Scripture truly says? The truth is, that assumption has never been universally held. Not in the earliest centuries of the faith, not by those who guarded the oldest scrolls. In fact, there is an ancient book, once read and revered, now hidden and dismissed, that suggests something far more unsettling. It's called the Book of Jubilees, a text once cherished among early Jewish communities and preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, but later cast out by those shaping the canon. Why? Because Jubilees claims the law didn't begin with Moses at all. It says the law was written on heavenly tablets before the earth was formed, that it was given to the angels, that Adam received commandments long before Sinai ever saw fire, that Enoch walked by laws not yet revealed to any nation, that Noah made sacrifices according to statutes still unknown to Israel, and that Abraham was already keeping Sabbath before Moses was born. If this is true, it changes everything, because then Moses wasn't receiving something new, he was recovering something eternal. He wasn't the beginning, he was the reminder. And that means the law we thought was a reaction to sin may have been the blueprint for holiness from the start. But if that's the case, why was this version of the story hidden? Why was Jubilees erased? And why does almost no one talk about this anymore? What if the real danger wasn't the law itself, but the knowledge that it didn't begin with Moses? Why was the Book of Jubilees banned? And more importantly, who banned it? This wasn't just another ancient manuscript gathering dust in the margins of history. Jubilees once stood shoulder to shoulder with Genesis. It was held in reverence by the community at Qumran, whose Dead Sea Scrolls preserved some of the earliest fragments of sacred scripture. It remains enshrined in the Ethiopian Bible to this day. For centuries, it was not seen as controversial, but foundational, a book that clarified the sacred timeline of creation, law, covenant, and destiny. So why was it removed? The answer is both simple and explosive. Jubilees tells a version of the story that no longer fit the framework being constructed by religious authorities. A story in which the law of God wasn't born at Sinai. It didn't begin with Moses. According to Jubilees, the law predated Moses by millennia. It was inscribed on heavenly tablets before the earth was formed. It was taught by angels to Adam. It guided Enoch, sanctified Noah, governed Abraham, and structured time itself through a 364-day sacred calendar. Sinai, in this story, wasn't a beginning. It was a reminder. This version of the law poses a direct challenge to the centralized theological structure that emerged after the destruction of the Second Temple. A structure that increasingly leaned on Moses as the sole mediator of God's will. If Moses was not the origin, but merely the restorer, then religious authority had to be re-evaluated. Jubilees undermine the idea that the law was a temporary covenant born out of Israel's wilderness moment. It asserted instead that the law was eternal, cosmological, predating not just Moses, but even sin itself. And so, the book had to be buried. It was labeled pseudepigrapha. It was cast out of councils. Its testimony was erased from sermons, not because it lacked truth, but because it carried too much clarity, too much consistency, too much danger. Because if the law didn't begin with Moses, then everything built on that assumption begins to tremble. What would it mean for modern faith if the foundation we've been standing on was never really the beginning? Before there was earth, sky, sea, or man, there was law. According to the Book of Jubilees, the law of God was not born in response to sin. It was not written as a last-minute reaction to chaos or rebellion. It existed long before the fall of Adam, before Eden, before even the foundation of the world. It was etched into what the text calls the heavenly tablets, a divine archive that holds not only the story of creation, but the structure of all righteousness. These tablets were not given to Israel. They were not handed to a prophet after the Exodus. They were part of the divine order itself. They encoded the Sabbath cycle, the sanctity of life, the prohibitions against immorality, and the entire system of purity and worship, not as commands to limit mankind, but as the cosmic architecture of holiness. The angels were the first to hold this law. They were created to know it, to keep it, and to teach it. And when humanity was formed, that same law was already waiting, unchanged, untainted, eternal. This changes everything. It means that righteousness was not invented for Israel. It means morality was not cultural. It was embedded into the fabric of time. The 364-day sacred calendar was not a later invention. It was part of the rhythm of creation. The sacrifices weren't created in the wilderness. They were reflections of a pattern already in heaven. Even the days of the week were not arbitrary. They were sacred markers of divine symmetry, preordained and precise. And if the law predates creation, then every act of sin, whether by watchers in heaven or humans on earth, is not breaking a rule that was added later. It is rebellion against a reality that existed before time began. Sin, then, is not just disobedience. It is cosmic disorder. It is an attempt to rewrite the code of creation. That's why the Book of Jubilees insists so boldly that the law is not merely historical, it is ontological. The law is not a footnote in history, it is the frame that holds history in place. And it was never meant to be hidden, it was meant to be remembered, to be honored, because it was there before we were. According to the Book of Jubilees, the law didn't begin with Moses, and Moses wasn't even the first human to receive it. The law was given before there was a nation to receive it, before a prophet could climb a mountain, before there were even humans to obey it. On the first day of creation, God made the angels, not just as messengers, but as keepers of divine instruction. They were entrusted with the heavenly tablets. Their purpose was to observe, record, and uphold the law throughout the cosmos. These were not idle celestial beings. They were the first stewards of holiness, bearing witness to a covenant that predated humanity. Then came Adam. When God formed Adam from the dust and breathed into him the breath of life, he didn't simply give him freedom, he gave him instruction. Do not eat from the tree. That was the first commandment given to a human soul, and it was more than symbolic. It was law, a clear boundary, a divine directive embedded in the very logic of Eden. And what happened when Adam broke it? He was judged. He was exiled. He experienced death, not as a punishment invented later in Mosaic codes, but as the direct consequence of violating a law that already carried weight. Pain in childbirth, toil in labor, separation from the presence of God. These were legal judgments, not arbitrary outcomes. The Garden of Eden, then, wasn't just a paradise. It was the first sanctuary, the first covenantal space governed by the law. And Adam wasn't the only one. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, was taken up by God not just because of his righteousness, but because he walked in accordance with the law. Jubilees reveals that the angels instructed Enoch in these heavenly ordinances. They taught him the structure of time, the rhythm of sacrifices, the laws of purity and justice. Enoch didn't invent these truths. He received them, he recorded them, he passed them on. This means the law was not a national identity. It was a sacred inheritance. It flowed from the angels to Adam, from Adam to Enoch, long before it ever reached Moses. The covenant wasn't waiting for Sinai. It was already unfolding in Eden, being remembered through Enoch, and restored in each generation that dared to remember what had been written in heaven. And if that's true, then everything we thought began with Moses was, in fact, a recovery of something far older, something the angels still remember. The law was not invented in response to sin. It was the foundation of creation itself. And the covenants made with Noah and Abraham didn't introduce new laws. They reaffirmed eternal ones that had already been written on the heavenly tablets. After the flood, God gave Noah what many consider to be the first moral guidelines of a post-Eden world. Do not eat blood, do not murder, honor life, offer sacrifices with clean hands. But according to the Book of Jubilees, these weren't spontaneous instructions. They were restorations, reminders of what had already been written in heaven before the world was formed. The command to avoid blood, for instance, wasn't about diet. It was about sacredness. Life was in the blood, and the law had always declared it holy. This continuity doesn't stop with Noah. When God made a covenant with Abraham, he commanded circumcision. Most readers see this as a new religious rite, a mark of distinction for a new people. But Jubilees presents a different view. It says circumcision was not a cultural invention or an ethnic identifier. It was a heavenly ordinance. It was already recorded on the tablets above, long before Abraham walked the earth. What Abraham received was not innovation, it was inheritance. He aligned himself with a law that had always existed, and in doing so, entered into a covenant that transcended time. Then there is the Sabbath. Many treat the Sabbath as a uniquely Jewish tradition rooted in Mosaic law and Israelite identity. But Jubilees makes a radical claim. The Sabbath was observed in heaven before it was ever observed on earth. It was kept by the angels before it was commanded to men. It wasn't given to a nation. It was built into the rhythm of creation. 6 days shall you labor, but the seventh is holy. Not because Sinai declared it so, but because the cosmos itself was structured that way from the beginning. These revelations reframe everything. The law wasn't a patchwork stitched together after human failure. It wasn't divine improvisation in response to chaos. It was and is the architecture of order, written in eternity, preserved by angels, renewed by covenants, and echoed by every generation that chose remembrance over rebellion. And so, when Moses later received the law on Sinai, he wasn't stepping into something new. He was stepping into a stream that had been flowing since before the stars. A covenant older than sin. A law older than nations. A sacred memory calling humanity to return, not to tradition, but to the truth that has never changed. The law was never just a list of commands. It was a calendar, a rhythm, a divine schedule etched into the fabric of time itself. And when that rhythm was broken, so was the covenant. According to the Book of Jubilees, the original calendar ordained by heaven was a 364-day cycle. It wasn't arbitrary, it was precise, ordered, and mirrored the structure of creation. This calendar ensured that every feast, every Sabbath, every appointed time aligned with sacred patterns set in the heavens. Angels followed it. The patriarchs followed it. Even creation moved in step with it. But something changed. As generations passed, humanity shifted from this heavenly timekeeping. Some adopted a 365-day solar calendar. Others leaned into lunar cycles that drifted and warped with each season. These small adjustments seemed harmless, even logical. But the Book of Jubilees warns otherwise. Changing the calendar was not a neutral act. It was rebellion cloaked in practicality. It was a sin against time. When the calendar changed, people began celebrating feasts on the wrong days. Sabbaths fell out of sync. Sacred offerings were made at times never sanctioned. Slowly, the entire structure of God's law began to erode, not through direct defiance, but through disorientation. People no longer knew when to return, when to rest, when to remember. The spiritual architecture collapsed, not because the law was forgotten, but because the time of the law was corrupted. This wasn't merely a ritual mistake, it was a cosmic fracture. The Book of Jubilees doesn't mince words. They will forget the new moons, the seasons, the Sabbaths, and they will go wrong as to all the order of the years. That word, order, is critical. God's law is not just about behavior, it is about alignment. Keeping the law meant keeping time with heaven. When humanity stepped out of sync, we stepped out of covenant. And yet, most believers today have no idea this ever happened. The 364-day calendar has been buried, ignored, dismissed as irrelevant or lost. But its erasure was not accidental, it was strategic. Because without sacred time, sacred law becomes a blur. And without law, we no longer see the pattern we were made to follow. This is the tragedy Jubilees unveils. Sin didn't always begin with pride or violence. Sometimes it began with a quiet drift in the calendar, a subtle miscount, a lost Sabbath. And that drift created a world where holy days became hollow days, where humanity wandered through time without knowing how far we had fallen from the divine rhythm. The question is no longer just, what is the law, but when is the law? Because if we've been keeping time wrong, we've been keeping faith out of step. And that misalignment might explain why so many feel spiritually exhausted, disconnected, out of season. The law was not just given, it was timed. And somewhere along the way, we stopped counting the way heaven counts. Moses did not write the law. He received it, and not just from the voice of God echoing atop Mount Sinai, but through the hands of an angelic witness, the angel of the presence, who read aloud from a divine archive that already existed long before Moses was born. This is the testimony of the Book of Jubilees. In its opening chapter, we are taken behind the veil of Sinai, not to the thunder and fire seen by Israel below, but into the secret place where Moses is invited higher, not just to hear God's will, but to see it. Written, sealed, eternal. The text says that the angel was commanded to write for Moses from the beginning of creation till my sanctuary has been built among them forever. But even more striking is this: the angel does not create anything new. He simply unveils what had already been written on the heavenly tablets. These heavenly tablets are not symbolic. They are the original record, the blueprint of divine law etched into the very order of the cosmos. They include the festivals, the laws of purity, the calendar, the covenant signs, and moral commandments. Nothing Moses receives is invented for his time. Everything is restored from an ancient memory, God's memory. This redefines everything. For centuries, Moses has been viewed as the founder of God's law, the great legislator, the one who established the covenant code at Sinai. But Jubilees turns that assumption on its head. Moses was not a lawmaker. He was a law receiver, a steward of something much older, much higher, much more eternal. The law, then, is not a reaction to sin. It is not a temporary response to human failure. It is not a system designed for one people in one place. It is the architecture of holiness, scripted before time began, upheld by the angels, embedded into creation, and finally handed down at the right moment. Not invented, but remembered. This is why the angel of the presence matters. He is not a mere messenger. He is a witness, a guardian, one who has stood in the place where heaven keeps record. The law Moses receives is not localized. It is cosmic. When he writes the Torah, he is not starting a religion. He is transcribing a revelation of what has always been. This is why Sinai shook, not because something new was being born, but because something eternal was being reintroduced into a world that had forgotten its origin. We are not followers of a legal code improvised in the desert. We are inheritors of a pattern that predates even the stars. Every command Moses inscribed, every statute he delivered, every covenant he renewed, it all flowed from a celestial source. And that source still speaks. If the law was already written in heaven, then the question shifts from, is this still relevant, to, are we still aligned with what is unchanging? Sinai wasn't the beginning. It was a return, and Moses wasn't the author. He was the reader of a sacred script authored by the Most High himself. Moses was not the architect of God's law. He was its scribe, its recorder, its faithful copyist, entrusted not with innovation, but with restoration. According to the Book of Jubilees, this distinction is not a minor detail. It is the key to understanding the true depth of his mission. The text declares that Moses was commanded to write down everything, not to invent new rules, not to craft new rituals, but to record what had already been established in heaven and lived by the righteous of old. He was told to write so that Israel would remember the commandments of the Lord and not sin against them. In other words, the law wasn't born at Sinai, it was recovered. This reframes everything. What Moses did was closer to translation than legislation. He was copying the heavenly blueprint. He was transcribing a sacred memory, not creating a religious system from scratch. Think of a builder restoring a temple long buried under centuries of dust. Moses did not design the house. He simply revealed its foundation and traced its original lines so that the people could dwell in it once again. This is why he is repeatedly told to write again, not speak your wisdom or create something new, but write faithfully, precisely, and according to what was already recorded on the heavenly tablets. He was restoring access to a divine order that had always existed, but had been lost in the fog of time, rebellion, and forgetfulness. In this light, Moses becomes more than a lawgiver. He becomes a covenant guardian. His role is sacred not because he invented holiness, but because he guarded it, protected it, passed it down when it was at risk of vanishing forever. He stood between memory and amnesia, between the ancient order and a people teetering on the edge of chaos. Jubilees does not diminish Moses by saying this. It honors him. For what is more noble than to be chosen as the scribe of heaven? What calling could be higher than to carry the weight of divine remembrance? Moses was not a spiritual founder. He was a sacred reminder. And here is the deeper truth. If Moses restored, then that means something had been lost. It means there was a fall, not just from Eden, but from sacred knowledge. It means that the law was not given to control, but to recall, to bring humanity back into alignment with what was always intended. This also means the law is not ethnic, it's not political, it's not a cultural artifact of the ancient Near East, it's cosmic. It belongs to the architecture of creation itself. And Moses, far from being the author of a limited code, was the human pen tracing divine contours, line for line, word for word, so that the sacred rhythm could return. We often celebrate prophets who speak something new, but Moses was chosen because he remembered. And that may be the holier task. To write again is to reclaim. To copy the eternal is to call a lost generation home. And in that quiet, reverent work, Moses fulfilled one of the most misunderstood but most magnificent roles in human history. Not the lawmaker, but the law scribe, the faithful steward of a covenant older than time. The law was not born out of sin. It was not God's response to failure. It existed before failure, before Adam stretched out his hand, before the serpent whispered, before the garden was violated. This changes everything. According to the Book of Jubilees, the law was present from the beginning, not as punishment, but as pattern. Adam was given a clear commandment in Eden: do not eat from the tree. The moment that commandment existed, the law was already present. It wasn't reactionary, it was foundational. And the fact that Adam could transgress proves something deeper, that a covenant already surrounded him. A divine order had already been established. This order wasn't born from brokenness, it was born from holiness. It preceded the fall, and therefore it cannot be reduced to a bandage for sin. The law is not a rescue plan. It's the original blueprint, a map laid out by a creator who built the cosmos with wisdom, rhythm, and sanctity. To believe the law only appeared after the fall is to misunderstand God's nature. It is to assume that he governs by damage control. But what if instead he governs by design? The law is that design, timeless, steady, radiant. It means that our relationship with God didn't begin with guilt. It began with calling, not with shame, but with trust, not with punishment, but with purpose. And when we see that the law was not a reaction, but a revelation, we begin to recover the dignity we were always meant to carry. The law isn't the shadow of our sin, it's the light of his order, and it was always there. Most of us were taught to believe that the law came after the fall, that God introduced commandments only after humanity had sinned. It's a comforting thought in a way. It makes the law feel like a safety net, something provisional, perhaps even temporary. But what if that belief is completely backwards? What if the law wasn't a response, but a reality? According to the Book of Jubilees, the law was not given as an afterthought. It was not reactive. It was pre-existent. Before there was sin, before there was death, before Eve reached for the fruit, the law already was. Not floating in abstraction, but written. Not vague, but detailed. Not in human hands, but on heavenly tablets. It wasn't invented to stop sin. Sin was the breach of something already sacred. When Adam sinned, he didn't trigger a new system of divine rules. He violated one that was already in place. The command to not eat from the tree wasn't a test to later determine fault. It was a revelation that Adam had been created into a pre-existing sacred order. That order had boundaries, and those boundaries were not arbitrary, they were holy. This is not a minor shift in understanding. It redefines everything. It means the law is not God's plan B. It's not a patch sewn onto the garment of creation after it tore. It's the original stitching. It's the golden thread woven into the design of time itself. And that design, what Jubilees calls the Order of the Covenant, was established not at Sinai, but in Eden, even before Eden. The angels were given charge over it. Adam was placed under it. And when Enoch walked with God, he didn't stumble into a new revelation. He recovered a forgotten one, taught by angels, transcribed into books, handed down as a legacy that predated Moses by millennia. So when Moses stood at Sinai, he wasn't witnessing the law's birth. He was witnessing its return, its unveiling, its restoration. This truth should shake us, because if the law was always there, then sin is not the origin of divine instruction. It's the rebellion against something already eternal. It means the law isn't a prison, it's a mirror of heaven. And the covenant isn't a contract signed out of fear. It's a reflection of the Creator's rhythm, pulsing through the bones of creation. We grieve when we see it only as judgment. We diminish it when we treat it as reaction. But when we see it as design, timeless, sacred, intentional, we begin to see our place within it. The law was never meant to shame us. It was meant to shape us, not to limit, but to align. And when we turn away from it, we're not escaping oppression. We're leaving the path of alignment with God's eternal order. This isn't just about rules, it's about returning to a rhythm older than sin, to a covenant written before time. You were never meant to wander through a fractured calendar or live by a rhythm that was never yours. The days we count, the months we name, the years we celebrate, they were altered long ago, bent out of shape by hands that forgot the harmony of heaven. But you, even now, are being called back, not just to remember a forgotten book, but to restore a sacred timeline. If we walk through time on a crooked path, we will always miss the appointments of the covenant. We'll arrive late to festivals meant to align us. We'll skip over Sabbaths meant to restore us. We'll forget what was written in the stars and woven into creation. And in that forgetfulness, we don't just lose sacred days, we lose our place. The Book of Jubilees dares to whisper what few have heard in generations. The law is not a burden from Sinai, but a blueprint from Eden. The calendar of 364 days isn't an alternative, it's the original. The order of time, the sacred weeks, the appointed festivals, the covenant signs, they were not made for a religion, they were made for a people who would walk with God. You. Jubilees does more than preserve history. It offers a map back home. To restore the law is not to become legalistic. It is to return to the heartbeat of creation, to return to a timeline where every seventh day breathes rest, where every season carries meaning, where every offering remembers Eden. This isn't just about the past. This is about realignment, about choosing again the covenant that was always there, not invented by Moses, not crafted by Israel, but revealed again and again to those willing to return. You do not need to create a new path. You need to recover the one already written. It's been preserved, buried beneath translations, hidden behind traditions, guarded in a book once silenced, but now revealed, not for nostalgia, but for restoration, not to imprison you in rules, but to free you from the drift of false time, because the true timeline was never lost, only forgotten, and your return is not a reinvention, it is a remembering, a reconnection to the covenant you were always meant to walk in. So take one breath, one step, one choice, and return. Return to the sacred rhythm, return to the covenant of the days, return to the law that predates sin, return to the God who wrote it for you before you ever asked why. What if there was a priesthood so ancient, so sacred, that it existed before Israel was ever born, before Levi, before Sinai, before even the first temple was raised from stone? A priesthood that operated not in shadows, but in the earliest light of the world. The Book of Genesis quietly records a pattern. Adam offering in Eden, Abel bringing the firstborn of his flock, Noah building an altar after the flood, and Melchisedec blessing Abraham with bread and wine. But through all these moments, sacred, deliberate, patterned, not once does the text explain where they learned to do these things. No commandments had been given, no priestly tribe had been chosen, no Torah had been written. So how did they know? Who taught Abel the sacred timing and order of a burnt offering? Who instructed Noah on clean and unclean animals for sacrifice when the law of Moses wouldn't appear for centuries? And why does Melchisedec, who has no recorded lineage, suddenly emerge as a priest of God Most High, as if stepping from a realm older than the patriarchs themselves? The silence isn't a gap, it's a signal, a sign that there was once a sacred order, forgotten, erased, or buried, that flowed beneath the surface of the early world. A line of priests that didn't descend from Levi, but from a covenant more ancient than Israel itself. A priesthood that was never abolished, only hidden. But hidden by whom? And for what reason? If this priesthood really existed, traced from Adam to Noah to Melchisedec, then what else have we been missing? And why would such a foundational truth be pushed aside from our theology, our traditions, and even our memory? These aren't just questions of history, they're questions of identity. Because if the forgotten priesthood still speaks, if its covenant still echoes, then maybe the call of the altar wasn't just for them. Maybe it was always for us. Cain's story is often reduced to jealousy and murder. A man driven by envy, striking down his brother in a field. But what if that wasn't the beginning of his fall? What if Cain's sin didn't start with a weapon, but with a broken altar? Genesis tells us that both brothers brought offerings to God. Cain from the fruit of the ground, Abel from the firstborn of his flock, along with their fat portions. And God accepted Abel's offering, but not Cain's. The text is brief, but loaded with implication. God doesn't reject random gifts. The problem wasn't the offering itself, it was the heart behind it, the timing, the obedience. Abel understood something sacred. Cain ignored it. This wasn't a casual act, it was a sacred ritual, a priestly act, performed before Levi ever walked the earth. So the question echoes again. How did Abel know what to offer and how to offer it? There must have been a teaching, a law, a pattern already in place, already expected, which means Cain didn't just bring the wrong gift. He violated a known structure. He stood at a sacred threshold and chose defiance. And what followed was more than murder. Cain's killing of Abel wasn't just a personal feud. It was a rebellion against the sacred priesthood, a strike against the covenant being quietly carried by his younger brother. In taking Abel's life, Cain didn't just spill blood. He tried to silence the witness of a holy law, a law passed down not by Moses, but from the very mouth of heaven. That's why his punishment wasn't death, but exile. God marked Cain, yes, but also removed him from the land, from the altar, from the ground that had once yielded its strength to him. It was the first priestly excommunication, a man who wanted blessing without obedience, a worshipper in form but not in spirit, a rebel priest. And Cain's line, what did it become? Builders of cities, creators of tools, fathers of music and metal, but never again did they return to the altar. The lineage of rebellion continued without sacrifice, without covenant. Cain wasn't just the first murderer. He was the first who tried to remake worship in his own image, and thousands of years later, his echo still lingers. Every time we approach God on our terms, every time we sever worship from obedience, we resurrect the path of the exiled priest. But God's true law was never erased, only ignored. And in the silence after Abel's blood cried out, heaven was already preparing another priest, one who would walk so closely with God that he would not see death, one who would keep the sacred timeline alive. His name was Enoch. Before sin entered the world, before blood was spilled, before exile and toil became man's daily burden, there was rhythm, a sacred rhythm. The Book of Jubilees, often forgotten but once cherished, preserves a detailed Genesis barely whispers. In Jubilees 2:18-33, we read that on the very first Sabbath, God did not only rest, he instructed Adam to honor that rest. The seventh day was not just a pause in creation, it was the seal of a covenant. And Adam was the first to receive it, not as a suggestion, but as a law, a command, a holy entrustment. This changes everything. We've long assumed that God's laws came after sin, that statutes were reactions to rebellion, that the covenant was a repair plan. But Jubilees tells a different story. The law was before the fall, not as punishment, but as design. Eden wasn't lawless, it was sacred. And Adam, he wasn't just the first man, he was the first priest. The command to keep and guard the garden, as stated in Genesis 2:15, uses Hebrew words, shamar and abad, that also describe the duties of temple priests. Adam's role was not simply to tend nature, it was to preserve holiness. The garden was not merely a paradise, it was the first sanctuary. And within that sanctuary, rhythms were already flowing, days set apart, times appointed, offerings understood. Even before sin, there was sacrifice, not of blood, but of time, of intention, of obedience, a laying down of self to align with divine order. Adam was shown how to mark the Sabbath, how to separate what was holy from what was common. This wasn't man reaching up, it was God reaching down, teaching his image-bearer the cadence of heaven. And when Adam fell, it wasn't just the loss of innocence, it was the loss of office. The priest failed, the sanctuary was breached, and the sacred rhythm was broken. But it didn't end there. Because the law Adam received didn't vanish with the cherubim's sword, it was remembered, preserved, passed down in fragments, whispers, rituals, until one man would rise to walk with God again, until one family would keep the Sabbath once more, until one covenant would be restored on the other side of a flood. The law was not born in Sinai, it was planted in Eden. And Adam, whether we've seen him this way or not, was the first to bear it. A priest of the garden temple, entrusted with time itself. And when he lost it, the world didn't just lose paradise, it lost its first altar. He was not a king, not a warrior, not even a prophet in the traditional sense. And yet Enoch, the seventh from Adam, was lifted, not by rebellion, not by death, but by divine favor. The Book of Jubilees gives us a picture far deeper than Genesis ever reveals. Enoch was not merely a righteous man, he was a priest of time. Jubilees 4:17-24 tells us that Enoch learned to read the heavenly books. He recorded the appointed times, the sacred festivals, the Sabbaths, and the laws written on the heavenly tablets. This was no mysticism, it was order, celestial precision. He became the guardian of the sacred rhythm that Adam first received, and in doing so, Enoch stepped into the lost role of Eden's priest. He was called wise, the first to record divine time, the first to map heaven's rhythm into earth's calendar. He didn't build an altar of stone, but he built something greater, a record of divine alignment. And when God took him, it wasn't because his work ended, but because it was preserved. Enoch became a symbol of the heavenly priesthood, of the possibility that humans could once again walk in step with heaven. Then the flood came. When the waters subsided and the earth lay still, Noah emerged, not just as a survivor, but as a priest. Jubilees 6:1-22 describes a profound moment. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices, but he doesn't do this from instinct. He follows the books, the same books passed from Enoch. The sacred knowledge had not drowned. Noah's offering is described with detail, order, and reverence, and in that act, the covenant is renewed. Not merely with words, but with blood, fire, and time. God marks it with a rainbow, a seal, a sign that the rhythm was not lost forever. But Noah doesn't stop there. He restores the calendar, 364 days, not 365, not lunar cycles, but a perfect, divine pattern aligned with the heavenly tablets. He warns his descendants that if they abandon this calendar, they will forget the appointed times. They will miss the Sabbaths. The festivals will fall out of season, and the covenant will fray. This isn't about dates, it's about alignment, about fidelity, about remembering what was passed down long before Sinai. Noah, like Enoch, became a carrier of sacred time, a priest not by tribe but by calling. He stood at the intersection of worlds, the old and the new, the destroyed and the restored, and chose to remember. And so the timeline didn't break. It bent, but it did not snap. Through Enoch's wisdom and Noah's obedience, the sacred rhythm endured, hidden beneath the waters, guarded by memory, waiting to rise again in a people who would one day reclaim it. We often imagine that the law began with Moses, etched into stone atop Mount Sinai, thunder echoing through the wilderness. It's the defining image of divine instruction. But what if that moment wasn't the beginning, but a restoration? The Book of Jubilees offers a stunning reframe. It says the law wasn't invented at Sinai. It was remembered. It had been written long before, on heavenly tablets guarded by angels, observed by the righteous from Adam to Noah, passed through Abraham and entrusted once again to Israel, not as a new gift, but as a sacred inheritance nearly lost. Jubilees 1:27 declares that the angel didn't deliver a fresh revelation to Moses. He came to remind. Write for Moses from the beginning of creation till my sanctuary is built among them forever. Not a new law, but the recording of what already existed. The angel was a messenger, not a lawgiver. Heaven was not improvising, it was restoring. And Moses? He wasn't the founder of a new religion. He wasn't creating a fresh system for a newly freed people. He was the scribe of memory, the steward of sacred continuity. He was chosen not because Israel needed a law, but because they had forgotten the one they were always meant to live by. This changes everything. Sinai becomes less about innovation and more about resurrection. The giving of the law becomes a reawakening of an ancient covenant, a reintroduction to a priesthood that had already been established in Eden, modeled by Enoch, preserved by Noah, and embodied by Abraham. Even the 10 Commandments are echoes, echoes of the Sabbath kept in Eden, echoes of honor between generations, echoes of faithfulness that predate the tablets. Sinai, then, is not the origin, it is the remembrance. And when Moses received the instruction to write it all down, it wasn't to create a law code, it was to preserve a priestly lineage. The law was not Israel's innovation, it was their inheritance. Not a national document, but a sacred map tracing back to the garden. Jubilees doesn't just point to Moses as lawgiver, it exalts him as restorer, a man caught between a forgetful people and a remembering God. He did not build the priesthood, He reopened the path to it, and in doing so, he revealed a sobering truth. God's law didn't start at Sinai. It was never meant to be optional, cultural, or temporary. It had always been, and always will be, a mirror of heaven's rhythm entrusted to those who dare to remember. Genesis 14:18-20 delivers one of the most jarring narrative intrusions in all of Scripture. Out of nowhere, a man steps into the scene. No context, no lineage, no explanation. Then Melchisedec, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. That's all we are told. No origin, no family, no tribe, no introduction. And yet, he blesses Abraham, the very man through whom the covenant would pass. This is not a normal priest. In a Bible obsessed with genealogies, chapter upon chapter listing who begot whom, Melchisedec stands outside the system. He is never connected to Adam, not to Seth, not to Shem, not to Levi. He simply is. And that silence is thunderous. It is not neglect. It is theology. The letter to the Hebrews picks up on this shocking omission and turns it into a revelation. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Hebrews 7:3. The writer is not saying Melchisedec was literally immortal. He is saying something deeper, that Melchisedec represents a priesthood that existed before the law and outside of it. A priesthood not established by human birthright, but by divine appointment. A priesthood not bounded by tribal affiliation or temple protocol. A priesthood that resembles eternity. And Melchisedec didn't just appear randomly. He brought bread and wine, symbols that would one day echo at the Last Supper. He didn't just bless Abraham, he received tithes from him. And Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, bowed to this priest of an older order. That reversal is staggering. It means the Levitical line bowed in seed form to something higher. Melchisedec is not just a figure of mystery. He is a theological rupture, a revelation that there was a sacred priesthood before Levi ever breathed, before Sinai was scorched, before Israel even existed. He doesn't belong to the past. He breaks through it. This is not an afterthought. This is a signpost, a divine reminder that God's covenantal structure, his priesthood, his law, his appointed representatives, was never a reaction to sin or history. It was eternal. And Melchizedek's sudden appearance, his lack of genealogy, his timeless blessing, all point to this truth. God had already established a way to mediate holiness on earth, not through men born into it, but through a calling that transcends lineage. It is a priesthood rooted not in blood, but in covenant, not in tribe, but in eternity. And the fact that Abraham honored it means that this ancient priesthood wasn't forgotten. It was known, revered, and remembered, even if only for a moment, by a man chosen to father nations. When Melchizedek steps forward to bless Abraham in Genesis 14, the scene seems brief, almost passing. But within that moment lies a theological explosion. Abraham, the patriarch, the chosen one, the father of nations, receives a blessing, not from an angel, not from God directly, but from a man, Melchisedec, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. And Abraham bows. In Jewish tradition, the one who gives the blessing holds the greater spiritual authority. The book of Hebrews makes this clear. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Hebrews 7:7. This means Abraham, the recipient of God's covenant, the bearer of promise, recognized something in Melchisedec that exceeded his own office. He submitted to a priesthood that was not based on the yet-to-be tribe of Levi, but on something older, deeper, divine. And what does Melchisedec bring out? Bread and wine, not lamb or oxen, not incense. Bread and wine, symbols of nourishment, covenant, and later, redemption. These are not random elements. They whisper of another priest to come, another covenant, another blessing. Centuries later, Psalm 110 would record a divine declaration. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchisedec. This is not spoken to David. This is not about any earthly king. This is the voice of Yahweh speaking to his Messiah. The Messiah would not be a Levitical priest. He would not offer animal sacrifices or serve in a temple made by hands. His priesthood would be eternal, like Melchizedek's, rooted not in genealogy, but in divine appointment. And this is exactly what the New Testament affirms about Jesus. The Gospels show him breaking bread and sharing wine, not as symbols of Passover alone, but as the elements of a new covenant. Hebrews calls him our great high priest, not after the order of Levi, but after the order of Melchizedek. This means the priesthood of Melchizedek wasn't a one-time anomaly. It was a foreshadowing, a prototype of something that would come again, not through ritual, but through revelation. And that priesthood blesses kings. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, setting the precedent that the highest spiritual office is not one of governance, but of intercession. It's the priest, not the king, who carries the authority to stand between heaven and earth. And now, in Christ, that office returns. He is the priest-king who blesses his people, who offers bread and wine not from Salem, but from Zion, who brings not just the sign of covenant, but the covenant himself. So when Melchizedek blessed Abraham, he wasn't just performing a rite, he was revealing a line, a sacred line, one that would re-emerge in the Messiah and never end, a line that stretches from Genesis to Revelation, from Eden's altar to heaven's throne. And in that line, we don't just find a priest, we find hope. Before the temple fell, before the ark was lost, before Israel was scattered and exiled, something deeper was forgotten. The priesthood, not the Levitical system alone, not the visible rituals or temple garments, but the ancient priesthood that predated Sinai, predated Levi, predated even Abraham. The priesthood that held time itself in rhythm with the divine. This loss didn't happen in a single day. It faded slowly beneath layers of conquest and compromise, of foreign altars and forgotten Sabbaths. It was not just geopolitical exile, it was spiritual amnesia. Israel forgot not only where it came from, but who they were meant to be, a kingdom of priests. A people who didn't just obey laws, but carried the presence of God. Jubilees tries to restore this memory. It reaches back beyond Moses to Enoch and Noah, to Melchizedek and the heavenly tablets. It does not invent a new religion. It remembers a forgotten one. A holy order where sacred time was marked, not just by festivals, but by alignment with God's breath, days counted, seasons blessed, altars built according to divine instruction. But when the priesthood was lost, When that sacred memory was severed, we didn't just lose rituals, we lost our compass. The law no longer pulsed with divine rhythm. It became an obligation instead of a covenant, a burden instead of a bond. And then the temple fell, not because God grew weary, but because his people forgot what the temple was for. It wasn't just a structure, it was the intersection of heaven and earth, and it required more than architecture. It required priests who remembered. When we read Scripture today and ask what happened, how did we lose so much? We often point to political collapse, to foreign invasion, to idolatry. But those are symptoms. The real fracture came earlier, when we forgot the priesthood, when we severed the line that connected Enoch to Noah, Noah to Melchisedec, Melchisedec to the Messiah. Without that memory, even the law itself can be misunderstood. Because if we don't remember who first kept it, we don't understand what we're continuing. Jubilees is not just a scroll, it's a recovery of origin, of purpose, of priesthood. It reminds us that before Israel was a nation, it was a calling. Before there was a temple, there was an altar. Before Sinai, there were heavenly tablets, and before we broke the covenant, we broke the memory. Now we stand in a world with no temple, no altar, no visible priesthood. But maybe what's truly missing isn't a building, it's remembrance, and that can be restored, if we're willing to remember. The priesthood was never meant to be confined to Levi. That was only a chapter, not the origin. The story doesn't begin at Sinai, or even with Abraham. It begins in Eden, with altars built not by tribes, but by men who walked with God. With time measured not by calendars of kings, but by rhythms written into creation itself. Enoch, Noah, Melchisedec, none were Levites. Yet all carried the priestly call. This is what the Book of Jubilees unveils. Not a replacement theology, a restoration, a map tracing the thread of sacred duty that runs through history, not bound to bloodline, but to alignment. It shows us that priesthood is not inherited by genealogy. It is reawakened by remembrance. The covenant still calls, not to a distant temple, not to rituals long lost, but to a living rhythm, to be one who remembers what the world has forgotten, to be a keeper of the sacred time, a restorer of the altar, a guardian of divine law, not as legal code, but as living relationship. And that calling isn't for some distant figure, it's for you. If you've ever wondered why your spirit stirs at ancient words, why your heart longs for more than church as usual, why you've always sensed a deeper thread running through your life, it's because you were never meant to just believe, you were meant to carry. You don't need to wait to be chosen. You were already chosen, not by tribe, not by birth order, not by the vote of men, but by the design of God. Before your name was spoken on earth, your role was written in heaven, to stand between heaven and earth, to mark time as sacred, to remember what was written, and to live as one who keeps covenant, not out of duty, but out of belonging. The priesthood was always bigger than one tribe. It was meant for all who would awaken, for all who would return, for all who would look back to Eden, not just as a story, but as a starting point. So now the question is not if you were called. The question is, will you remember?